After 30 years of military service, I believed I had earned some peace. Retirement beckoned with promises of quiet mornings and uninterrupted family time. My son Mason deserved a stable home after following me to bases around the world for most of his life. His condition, a rare neuromuscular disorder that affects temperature regulation, required specialized care and occasionally emergency intervention. The doctors recommended somewhere with mild weather patterns and good medical facilities nearby. That is how we found Oak Ridge Estates, a picturesque suburban community with manicured lawns and a seemingly friendly homeowners association. The two-story colonial we purchased sat on a corner lot, providing easy access from multiple directions, a strategic consideration born from years of contingency planning. I modified the home with subtle adaptations for mason handrails, a small exterior ramp disguised with landscaping, and emergency power backup systems. Most neighbors welcomed us warmly, fascinated by my career though I downplayed my rank, preferring to be known simply as Colonel, rather than by my actual status as Brigadier General. Our first homeowners association meeting seemed routine enough. Issues about holiday decorations, lawn maintenance standards, and community event planning filled the agenda. That was when I first noticed her Diane Winters, HOA treasurer, who sat rigidly in designer clothes, interrupting others with practiced authority. During introductions, she barely acknowledged me, but her expression changed noticeably when I mentioned Mason and his special needs. "We do have standards here at Oak Ridge," she commented when I inquired about accessibility guidelines. "Special exceptions tend to create a slippery slope." Her smile never reached her eyes. Other board members quickly assured me that reasonable accommodations were never a problem, but I noted how several glanced at Diane before speaking, as if seeking approval. I decided to join the Architectural Review Committee, applying my engineering background from the Corps of Engineers. Most members seemed relieved to have someone willing to review the technical aspects of proposals. Over coffee, after the third meeting, Walter from down the street warned me quietly about Diane. "She has been gunning for the presidency for years," he explained. "Almost has enough allies on the board now. Just watch yourself. She has a way of finding rule violations for people who cross her." I dismissed his concerns partially, having dealt with far more intimidating adversaries than a suburban power broker. Mason was settling in well, making friends with neighborhood children who were fascinated by his specialized wheelchair and technological gadgets. The local school developed an individualized education plan that exceeded my expectations. Life seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. As autumn faded and winter approached, I began implementing our cold weather protocols. Mason's condition meant that exposure to extreme cold could trigger a cascade of dangerous symptoms, from muscle rigidity to respiratory distress. I installed additional insulation, updated our emergency contact information with local services, and clearly marked our driveway and street access as an emergency zone, all with proper permits from the city. The first snow fell lightly in early December, dusting the neighborhood in picturesque white. Children built snowmen while Mason watched from the window, his eyes bright with vicarious enjoyment. I did not realize then that the idyllic scene before us was merely the quiet before a gathering storm, both literal and figurative, that would soon test the limits of my patience, training, and humanity. The January edition of the community newsletter arrived with a glossy cover featuring Diane Winters standing proudly before the neighborhood entrance. The headline announced her election as HOA president following the unexpected resignation of the previous leader. Rumors suggested he had faced intense pressure after approving several variance requests Diane had opposed. Her first presidential message emphasized, returning to the founding standards that make Oak Ridge estates exclusive and desirable. Within weeks, violation notices began appearing on doors throughout the neighborhood. Most cited obscure bylaw provisions that had rarely been enforced. Our first notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, a formal complaint about the unsightly medical equipment visible from the street. The equipment in question was an emergency generator, properly installed and permitted by the county. I scheduled a meeting with Diane, bringing documentation from both the county and medical necessity letters from Mason specialists. Her office in the community center displayed numerous framed certificates and recognition plaques from local business associations. She kept me waiting for 20 minutes before inviting me in. "Colonel," she said, not offering a handshake, "I understand your concerns, but rules exist for everyone. We cannot make exceptions based on personal circumstances, no matter how unfortunate." She barely glanced at the documentation I provided. "This is not about exceptions, but about legal accommodations protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act," I explained calmly, drawing on negotiation techniques that had served me well in diplomatic missions abroad. "The generator is necessary for Mason's medical equipment during power outages." Diane tapped perfectly manicured nails against her desk. "Submit the proper variance forms. The committee will consider your request at the next quarterly meeting." That meeting was 3 months away. When I pointed this out, she smiled thinly. "Perhaps you military types are used to immediate action, but civilian governance requires process and patience." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. That evening, I received calls from 3 neighbors who had witnessed my visit to the community center. Walter and his wife Martha offered immediate support, while elderly Mrs. Chen confided that her request for a first-floor bathroom addition had been denied despite her advancing arthritis. "Some neighbors are afraid to speak up," she admitted quietly. "Diane has friends on the city council and the local bank board." The weather forecast that February brought troubling news: an Arctic cold front approaching earlier than seasonal norms. I accelerated our winter preparations, ensuring Mason had redundant systems for every critical need. While installing additional insulation around our windows, I noticed newly erected signs throughout the neighborhood. "Resident parking only, violators will be towed immediately." One such sign stood directly beside our designated emergency vehicle access area. At the emergency HOA meeting called to discuss storm preparations, I raised concerns about the new parking restrictions. The city approved our emergency access zone last month. The new signs might confuse first responders. Diane peered at me over reading glasses. "The signs were approved by the board in a special session. Perhaps if you attended every meeting rather than just those convenient to your schedule, you would have been informed." No special session had been announced to general membership. That night, watching the first heavy snowflakes begin to fall, I stood at our front window calculating response times and access routes should Mason experience a crisis. My military training recognized the tactical positioning of those new signs. They effectively nullified our emergency zone without directly removing our approved markers. It was a bureaucratic flanking maneuver executed with precision. "Dad," Mason called from the living room where he was reading, "is everything okay?" I forced a smile and turned from the window. "Everything is fine, son. Just checking the weather." But the strategic part of my mind was already mapping contingencies for what increasingly felt like an inevitable confrontation. The blizzard struck with unexpected ferocity 3 days later. Weather forecasters called it the worst winter storm in 30 years as temperatures plummeted to -15 degrees, with wind chill factors approaching -30. Power flickered throughout the neighborhood. though our generator hummed efficiently, maintaining essential services. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, and emergency services announced limited response capabilities due to road conditions. I monitored Mason vigilantly as the storm intensified. His condition made him vulnerable to ambient temperature drops even inside our well-insulated home. By evening, he complained of increasing muscle stiffness, an early warning sign I had learned to recognize over years of managing his care. I increased the home temperature and administered his prescribed muscle relaxants, reviewing emergency protocols that had become second nature. "Just precautionary, buddy," I assured him, though concern was mounting as I noticed his lips taking on a subtle bluish tint despite the warm room. His skin felt cool to the touch, another warning sign. His body was struggling to maintain core temperature. Near midnight, Mason woke gasping for breath, his muscles visibly rigid. "Dad," he wheezed, eyes wide with panic. "Cannot move, hard to breathe." Training took over immediately. I activated the emergency oxygen system while simultaneously calling 911. The dispatcher confirmed my address and situation, promising to expedite response despite road conditions. I recited Mason's vital statistics and medication information from memory while applying emergency warming protocols and monitoring his oxygen saturation levels. "Ambulance dispatched," the operator confirmed. "Estimated arrival 8 minutes." I continued emergency treatment, speaking calmly to Mason though my heart raced with paternal terror. His breathing grew increasingly labored, each breath a visible struggle against muscles refusing to cooperate. The pulse oximeter showed declining numbers despite supplemental oxygen. The faint sound of sirens penetrated the howling wind after 11 agonizing minutes. Relief washed through me until the radio beside me crackled with dispatcher communications. "Unit 17 to dispatch. We have access issues at location. Emergency lane appears to be blocked by a civilian vehicle, attempting alternate approach." I rushed to the front window. Through swirling snow, flashing emergency lights illuminated a familiar red SUV parked directly across our designated emergency access lane. Diane's vehicle, positioned precisely to obstruct direct access to our front entrance and the wheelchair ramp. Paramedics were visible in the distance, forced to park on the main road and trudge through deep snow carrying essential equipment. "Dispatch, be advised, this will significantly delay patient contact," the radio crackled. I secured Mason with additional blankets and oxygen before rushing outside into the biting cold, wearing only a sweater. The paramedics struggled through knee-deep drifts, carrying cardiac and respiratory equipment that should have been wheeled directly to our door. "Sir, can you direct us to the patient?" the lead paramedic shouted over the wind. Before I could answer, headlights cut through the snow as another vehicle approached. Diane emerged from her sedan, wrapped in an expensive fur coat, and marched toward us with determined steps. "What is happening here? Why are emergency vehicles in the residential area?" she demanded, as if directing a minor neighborhood disturbance rather than a medical emergency. "My son is having a medical crisis. Your SUV is blocking the emergency access," I explained, gesturing toward the clearly marked zone now occupied by her vehicle. She glanced dismissively at the paramedics, now huffing past with equipment. That zone was never properly approved by the current board. Those vehicles need to use guest parking according to regulations updated last month. "The nearest guest parking is 400 yards away," I explained, struggling to maintain composure. "Mason needs immediate medical attention. People can die from his condition when treatment is delayed." "Rules exist for reasons, Colonel," she replied, emphasizing my lesser rank. I cannot simply move my vehicle every time someone claims an emergency. Do you know how many residents would suddenly have emergencies if exceptions were routinely granted? The lead paramedic returned, face grave with urgency. "Sir, we need additional equipment from the ambulance. His oxygen saturation is dropping rapidly." Inside the house, monitoring equipment began emitting high-pitched alarms audible even through closed doors and howling wind. Each piercing sound represented Mason's condition deteriorating further, seconds ticking away that could mean permanent damage or worse. The paramedics exchanged knowing glances, their experience telling them what I already knew: every minute mattered critically now. "Diane, move your vehicle immediately," I stated, no longer asking but commanding. She pulled out her phone. "I am documenting this aggressive behavior. The HOA will issue appropriate fines for your unauthorized emergency zone markers and for this confrontational conduct." Through the window, I could see Mason's nurse, who had arrived separately, administering emergency interventions while speaking urgently into a portable radio. His skin had progressed from pale to grayish, his lips now distinctly blue despite oxygen support. The thermometer beside his bed showed his body temperature dropping despite external warming measures. His condition was spiraling beyond standard emergency protocols. Time compressed into heartbeats as I stood trapped between my dying son and bureaucratic obstinance, wrapped in suburban entitlement. The paramedics continued working heroically despite the delay, but their expressions conveyed what instruments confirmed: we were losing precious ground with each passing moment. Something fundamental shifted inside me as I watched the paramedics struggling to save my son, while Diane continued recording with her phone, seemingly documenting rule violations rather than recognizing the life hanging in balance. 27 years of military discipline had trained me to control emotions under pressure, but also to recognize when decisive action becomes moral imperative. "Diane," I said, my voice dropping to the command tone that had silenced chaotic situation rooms and battlefield communications. "That vehicle will be moved now, by you or by emergency services." She stepped back, momentarily startled by the transformation in my demeanor, but quickly recovered her indignation. "Are you threatening me? I will have you removed from the board for this behavior alone." The lead paramedic interrupted, desperation evident in his voice. "Sir, we need the cardiac equipment from the ambulance immediately. His blood pressure is dropping critically." I turned to the emergency responders. How long would extracting my son through the back entrance take compared to bringing equipment here? "Too long," the paramedic answered grimly. "The drifts are deeper on that side. We need direct access now." Several neighbors had emerged onto their porches despite the biting cold, drawn by flashing lights and raised voices. Some began recording the confrontation on phones. Through the gathering crowd, I spotted Walter approaching with a determined expression, snow shovel in hand like a makeshift weapon. "This is not about HOA rules anymore," I told Diane, each word precisely measured. "This is now interfering with emergency medical response. As a brigadier general in the United States Army, I am informing you that obstructing emergency services is a criminal offense with serious consequences." Her eyes widened slightly at the revelation of my actual rank. "A general, you always said colonel." "I prefer humility in retirement. Right now, I prefer my son alive. Move the vehicle." More neighbors had gathered now, forming a semicircle around us. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her small frame bundled against the cold. "Diane, please. The boy needs help." Diane glanced around, suddenly aware of the audience and the cameras recording her decisions. This is still a violation of HOA protocols. There will be consequences. There absolutely will be, I agreed. But right now that vehicle moves. The standoff lasted another excruciating 30 seconds before Diane finally retrieved her keys and trudged toward her SUV. The gathered neighbors parted silently, faces registering varying degrees of shock and disappointment. Within moments, emergency responders rushed advanced cardiac equipment and additional warming devices into our home. Mason was evacuated to the waiting ambulance 12 minutes later, his condition stabilized but still critical. As they prepared to transport him, the paramedic supervisor pulled me aside. "Sir, I need to document what happened here. The delay in accessing your son likely contributed to the severity of his condition. There could be lasting consequences." "Document everything," I instructed, military precision returning to my voice. "Names, times, witnesses, and especially the deliberate obstruction of emergency access." At the hospital, the attending physician confirmed our worst fears. "The delay caused complications we should never have seen," he explained, reviewing test results. "His core temperature dropped dangerously low, and we are seeing signs of muscle and nerve damage that might have been prevented with faster intervention. He is stabilized now, but we need to monitor for permanent effects." Mason lay unconscious in the pediatric intensive care unit, surrounded by machines monitoring every vital function. Tubes and wires connected him to systems performing functions his body temporarily could not. The doctor assured me he would recover, but the extent of lasting damage remained uncertain. I sat beside his bed through the night, holding his hand as monitors beeped steadily around us. Dawn brought no improvement but no deterioration either, the precarious stability of critical care. A nurse brought coffee I did not drink and expressed sympathy I barely registered. My mind had entered operational planning mode, cataloging facts, witnesses, and applicable regulations. When Mason stirred shortly after sunrise, his first weak words broke something inside me. "Sorry, Dad," he whispered through parched lips. "Did I cause trouble?" "No, son," I assured him, swallowing hard against emotion threatening to overwhelm military stoicism. "You did nothing wrong, nothing at all." I waited until he drifted back to medication-induced sleep before stepping into the hallway to make a phone call to my former aide-de-camp, now working in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. His immediate response confirmed what I already knew. This situation extended far beyond neighborhood politics or personal grievance. "This ends now," I promised, returning to Mason's bedside. "What happened to you will never happen to anyone else in our neighborhood." The promise was not just to my son, but to myself, a mission statement for the campaign about to begin. The hospital room transformed into mission headquarters over the following days. My military career had taught me that emotion makes poor strategy, but righteous purpose fuels effective action. While Mason slept, recovering from the ordeal that nearly claimed his life, I methodically constructed a comprehensive response plan using the same strategic principles that had guided military operations under my command. A leather-bound notebook became my tactical journal, each page dedicated to specific objectives. First came intelligence gathering, understanding the full scope of the situation beyond our personal experience. Thomas, my former intelligence officer who had retired to corporate security, agreed to help without hesitation when I explained the situation. Basic background check on Diane Winters and the HOA structure, I instructed during his first visit to the hospital. Look for patterns of behavior, financial irregularities, previous complaints, anything that establishes a history. While Thomas worked his connections, I researched applicable laws and regulations. The Americans with Disabilities Act provided clear protections, but local and state housing regulations added layers of complexity. I contacted 3 neighbors who had witnessed the ambulance incident, requesting written statements while memories remained fresh. Mason improved gradually, though neurological tests confirmed minor nerve damage that would require additional therapy. Each medical report and treatment plan went into a separate file, documenting the direct consequences of delayed emergency response. The hospital administration, concerned about interference with patient care, provided official documentation of their findings without prompting. 1 week after the incident, Thomas delivered his preliminary findings. "You have stumbled into a hornet nest, General," he observed, sliding a folder across the small table in Mason's hospital room. "Diane Winters has a history of selective enforcement against specific homeowners, particularly those with medical accommodations or modifications." The folder contained testimonies from former residents who had moved rather than fight the HOA under her influence. An elderly widower had been denied permission for a driveway railing despite multiple falls. A family with an autistic child faced continuous citations for therapeutic equipment in their backyard. A decorated Vietnam veteran had eventually abandoned his request for a wheelchair ramp after months of bureaucratic obstacles. Most troubling were the financial discrepancies Thomas had uncovered. HOA dues increased 30% over 3 years, but the financial statements show minimal reserve growth, he noted. Several landscaping and maintenance contracts went to companies connected to board members without competitive bidding. I contacted Elizabeth Chen, daughter of our elderly neighbor, and coincidentally a civil rights attorney specializing in housing discrimination. Her outrage upon learning about Mason's experience and the pattern affecting vulnerable residents translated immediately into professional commitment. "This is precisely the type of case that changes policies and protects others," she explained during our first formal consultation. "The ADA has specific provisions regarding reasonable accommodations and emergency access. What happened to Mason represents textbook discriminatory practice." While Mason underwent physical therapy, I expanded our coalition strategically. Walter and Martha organized small neighborhood gatherings where affected residents could share experiences safely. Each meeting revealed additional instances of selective enforcement and intimidation. Elizabeth provided legal guidance on documenting violations and preserving evidence. Colonel James Richardson, my former logistics officer now working with the State Housing Authority, reviewed our growing documentation with professional interest. "This extends beyond HOA overreach into potential criminal liability," he observed. "Deliberately obstructing emergency medical services crosses statutory boundaries in this state." 3 weeks after the incident, Mason was discharged with ongoing therapy requirements but significant improvement. His resilience humbled me as he focused on recovery rather than resentment. "Are we going to move, Dad?" he asked as we finally returned home. "No, son," I answered, helping him navigate the hallway to his room. "In the military, we never abandon defensible ground or leave vulnerable people unprotected." That evening, 7 key neighbors gathered in our living room while Mason rested. Each brought additional documentation, photographs, or witness statements. Elizabeth Chen presented a comprehensive legal strategy focusing on ADA violations, discriminatory practices, and emergency services obstruction. Walter unveiled a petition signed by 63% of homeowners demanding an emergency board meeting to address these issues. "This is not revenge," I explained to the assembled group. "This is about accountability and protecting our community from abuse of authority. We proceed with discipline, documentation, and determination." As our planning session concluded, Richardson pulled me aside. "The State Housing Authority has taken interest in this case. They are willing to send observers to your HOA meeting." The strategic value of official government presence was not lost on anyone with military or legal background. The foundation was laid, alliance formed, and objectives established. What Diane had likely dismissed as an isolated confrontation with a stubborn homeowner had evolved into a coordinated campaign with legal, financial, and regulatory dimensions. The operational phase would commence at the emergency board meeting scheduled for the following week. The community center parking lot filled to capacity an hour before the emergency meeting was scheduled to begin. Residents who had never attended HOA proceedings arrived early, claiming seats and exchanging quiet conversations. Diane and her allied board members huddled near the podium, reviewing documents with visible concern as the crowd continued growing beyond normal attendance. I arrived 15 minutes before start time, accompanied by Elizabeth Chen carrying a professional briefcase and Thomas with a digital projector. Mason had insisted on attending despite my concerns about his stamina, his wheelchair navigating the recently installed temporary ramp that Mrs. Chen's son had constructed the previous day. Several neighbors nodded respectfully as we entered, some reaching out to touch Mason's shoulder in silent support. The meeting began with Diane attempting to limit discussion to scheduled agenda items, while deferring personal grievances to the standard complaints procedure. Her practiced authority faltered when Elizabeth stepped forward, identifying herself as legal counsel representing multiple residents. This emergency meeting was called under Bylaw Section 7.3 regarding urgent community safety concerns, Elizabeth stated, placing documentation on the board table. The petition satisfies quorum requirements for addressing these matters immediately. Diane glanced at the association attorney who nodded reluctantly, confirming the procedural validity. "Very well," she conceded. "You have 15 minutes to present your concerns." "We will require considerably more time," I replied, stepping to the podium. The room fell silent as I connected Thomas's laptop to the projector. "This presentation addresses systematic discrimination, financial irregularities, and public safety violations that demand immediate board action." The first slides displayed Mason's medical emergency timeline, with paramedic documentation and hospital reports. Photographs showed Diane's vehicle blocking the clearly marked emergency access lane. The ambulance service report specifically cited access obstruction as causing critical delays in treatment. Dr. Parker from the hospital had provided a statement directly linking these delays to Mason's complications and extended recovery requirements. "This was not an isolated incident, but part of an established pattern," I continued, advancing to testimonials from affected residents. Mrs. Chen described her denied bathroom modifications despite medical necessity. A father detailed citations received for his daughter's therapeutic sensory equipment. Walter presented documentation of selective enforcement targeting specific homeowners while ignoring violations by board members and their associates. Diane interrupted repeatedly during the first 20 minutes, attempting to dismiss evidence as anecdotal complaints and misunderstandings of necessary standards. Her objections diminished as Thomas displayed financial records obtained through proper channels, highlighting discrepancies between collected dues and reported expenditures. The landscaping contract awarded to Prestige Grounds represents a 40% premium over competitive bids, Thomas explained, displaying comparative quotes. Prestige Grounds is owned by James Winters, husband of our board president. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Elizabeth methodically outlined 7 specific violations of HOA bylaws regarding conflict of interest, competitive bidding requirements, and financial disclosure. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as evidence mounted against practices they had approved or ignored over the previous 3 years. These patterns establish liability extending beyond the association to individual board members who knowingly violated fiduciary responsibilities, Elizabeth explained. We have prepared comprehensive documentation for appropriate regulatory authorities. Diane finally abandoned pretense of procedural objection for direct confrontation. This vindictive presentation distorts context to punish enforcement of necessary community standards, she declared. Colonel Anderson has personal grievances after being cited for unauthorized modifications and is using his son's unfortunate medical situation to intimidate the board. The characterization of Mason's near-death experience as an unfortunate medical situation sent a visible ripple of discomfort through even her supporters. Before I could respond, the community center doors opened to admit several individuals whose professional bearing immediately commanded attention. Colonel Richardson entered first, accompanied by 2 representatives from the State Housing Authority. Behind them, a Department of Justice attorney specializing in ADA compliance cases introduced herself to the suddenly silent room. My former aide-de-camp, now Deputy Director for Civil Rights Enforcement, completed the delegation. The Department of Justice has opened a preliminary investigation into potential violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act within this association, he announced without preamble. We are here as observers today, but will be conducting formal interviews beginning tomorrow. The State Housing Authority representative added, our office has received multiple complaints regarding discriminatory practices and financial irregularities, warranting immediate review of association governance. Diane's complexion paled visibly as she recognized the professional credentials being presented. Her attempts to dismiss our concerns as neighborhood politics had evaporated with the arrival of state and federal authorities with subpoena power and regulatory oversight. The board attorney whispered urgently to Diane and other members, who engaged in tense discussion before requesting a 15-minute recess. When they returned, the association attorney addressed the assembly rather than Diane. The board acknowledges the seriousness of these concerns and proposes formation of an investigative committee including homeowner representatives to review all policies and practices, he stated carefully. Additionally, emergency access zones will be immediately enforced and all pending accommodation requests expedited for review. From my seat beside Mason, I observed Diane's transformation from confidence to comprehension. This was no longer a confrontation she could dominate through procedural manipulation or intimidation. The systematic approach had elevated neighborhood concerns to regulatory and legal scrutiny beyond her influence. Mason squeezed my hand, whispering, "You did not even need to wear your uniform, Dad." "The authority was never in the uniform, son," I replied quietly. "It was always in standing up for what is right." Spring arrived with renewed energy across Oak Ridge Estates. Fresh green shoots pushed through soil recently covered by snow that had nearly claimed my son. Throughout the neighborhood, visible changes reflected deeper transformations in community governance and priorities. The investigation had revealed more extensive issues than even our research had uncovered. 3 board members, including Diane, had resigned rather than face continuing scrutiny. Financial audits discovered misappropriated funds that had been redirected to unnecessary cosmetic projects, while essential infrastructure and safety measures remained unfunded. The State Housing Authority placed the association under temporary oversight while governance reforms were implemented. Emergency access lanes now featured prominent markings and regular enforcement patrols. The Architectural Review Committee, restructured with diverse membership including representatives with accessibility expertise, had approved 14 previously denied accommodation requests within the first month of reformed operations. Mrs. Chen received her bathroom modifications, installed by contractors who donated additional accessibility features after learning of her situation. Mason's recovery progressed steadily through spring. The nerve damage required ongoing therapy but showed significant improvement with each passing week. His resilience continued to inspire me as he focused on rehabilitation rather than dwelling on the injustice that had caused his condition. His perspective provided constant reminder of why our efforts mattered beyond personal vindication. The community healing process paralleled Mason's physical recovery. Neighbors who had witnessed the ambulance incident organized meal deliveries during his hospital stay. Others volunteered to assist with property maintenance while I focused on his care. Walter established a community emergency response team that coordinated with local services to ensure vulnerable residents received priority attention during crises. On an unusually warm April afternoon, I sat on our front porch watching Mason demonstrate his improving mobility by navigating our garden path. A familiar red SUV approached and parked across the street. Diane emerged, noticeably different from the commanding figure who had once blocked an ambulance access. Her designer clothes had been replaced by simple attire, her imperious posture now uncertain. She remained beside her vehicle until Mason noticed her presence and offered a small wave. Only then did she cross toward our property, stopping respectfully at the garden edge rather than approaching the porch directly. Her voice carried none of its former authoritative tone when she finally spoke. "I wanted to see how Mason is recovering," she said, eyes downcast. "The community newsletter mentioned his improvement." "He improves daily," I replied neutrally. "His determination exceeds even military standards." Silence stretched between us until she continued. "The legal consequences are proceeding. I have accepted responsibility for my actions and decisions." The Housing Authority investigation had resulted in civil penalties, and criminal charges regarding obstruction of emergency services remained under review. "That is appropriate," I acknowledged without elaboration. She gestured vaguely toward the neighborhood beyond our property. I never saw the impact of the rules as they affected real people. They were just standards to maintain property values to me. Her voice caught slightly. "I never imagined someone could be harmed by maintaining order." "That is the fundamental difference between authority and leadership," I observed. "Authority focuses on rules. Leadership focuses on those affected by them." Mason wheeled himself toward us, his therapy-strengthened arms propelling him confidently across the garden path. "Hello, Mrs. Winters." He greeted her with characteristic graciousness that reflected better character than many adults I had commanded. "Mason," she replied, visibly uncomfortable. "I came to say I am sorry for what happened, for my part in your injury." He considered her words thoughtfully. "Thank you for saying that. Dad says acknowledging mistakes is the first step toward fixing them." "Your father is a wise man," she conceded, glancing toward me with newfound respect. "Wiser than I recognized." After Diane departed, Mason asked the question I had been expecting. Do you think she really changed, Dad, or is she just sorry she got caught? Real change begins with consequences, I explained. Some people need to lose something valuable before they recognize what truly matters. What happens next determines whether the lesson transforms or merely inconveniences. The community gathered that weekend for the Spring Festival, the first under new HOA leadership. Emergency vehicles offered tour to children, demonstrating accessibility features and response protocols. The fire department conducted safety demonstrations, specifically addressing winter emergency procedures. Mason participated enthusiastically, his wheelchair navigating smoothly along newly improved pathways designed with universal access principles. From a quiet corner of the celebration, I observed the community that had emerged stronger from conflict. The military strategist in me recognized that our tactical response had achieved its objectives, but the father in me took greater satisfaction in the cultural transformation those tactics had enabled. Rules still existed, but they now served the community rather than controlling it. Elizabeth Chen joined me, offering lemonade as we watched Mason demonstrating his wheelchair to fascinated children. Your military background made this possible, she observed. The organization, evidence gathering, alliance building, very few civilians could have orchestrated such an effective response. The military taught me strategy, I acknowledged, but Mason taught me why it matters. In uniform, I protected abstract principles like freedom and justice. Here, I protected something far more tangible. As the festival continued around us, I reflected on how the skills honed through decades of military service had found unexpected application in civilian life. The discipline, strategic thinking, and moral courage required in combat zones proved equally valuable in confronting injustice hiding behind suburban respectability and regulatory complexity. Mason approached with a group of neighborhood children, his smile bright in the spring sunshine. Dad, they want to hear about your military adventures. Perhaps another time, I replied. Today is about celebrating our neighborhood and its future. That future now included emergency access lanes, reasonable accommodations for those who needed them, and governance that recognized community meant people rather than property values. Not through revenge, but through justice administered with strategic precision and moral clarity.